Picking up from our discussion of Tocqueville's historical perspective, let's dive into the core comparison he draws between American and European history. He argues that understanding America is simpler, really just two main ingredients: the drive for equality and the land itself. It's a story of people fighting against the raw elements to build their society, based on that one big idea. Think of it as a drama where the hero is battling nature, which frankly makes it sound a bit pathetic, doesn't it? Like a David versus Goliath story where Goliath is just a really tough landscape. But then you look at Europe. Oh boy, Europe is a whole different beast. Tocqueville says we need four key ingredients here: the old guard, the aristocratic ideal, the rising tide, the democratic ideal, the ever-present powerful state trying to manage everything, and the ghost of rebellion, the revolutionary tradition. This isn't just about people versus nature. It's a messy, complicated soap opera involving clashing social visions, a state that's bigger than any single vision, and periodic bursts of revolution that tear things apart and rebuild them. That, Tocqueville suggests, has all the makings of a real tragedy. Think Shakespeare, think Sophocles. Lots of conflict, high stakes, and maybe not a happy ending in sight. Now, Tocqueville digs deeper, almost into the language or semantics of these histories. He traces both democratic ideas back to those fiery religious reformers of the 16th century. But here's where the paths diverge sharply. In Europe, this spirit of questioning, of independent thought, think Luther challenging the Pope, Descartes doubting everything, Voltaire poking fun at the establishment, it kept growing. It became a kind of intellectual muscle feeding into revolutions in culture, politics, even religion. It gave Europe the potential for a society that was equal but still allowed for unique individuals, people who thought differently. But America? Tocqueville says this critical spirit kind of fizzled out there. Instead of fostering deep philosophical debate, it turned into just going along with what everyone else believes. There wasn't much of a philosophical tradition, or even much interest in it. Society just accepted its founding religious ideas without asking too many questions, and naturally, it accepted a bunch of moral rules tied to those ideas without much scrutiny either. So, while Europe was building this rich intellectual and revolutionary heritage, America, in Tocqueville's view, ended up with a society that was solid but perhaps a bit intellectually flat, lacking that spark of individual critical thought. So, what does this lead to? Tocqueville calls American development a grotesque development. Why? Because it took only half of Europe's freedom story, the democratic part, and ran with it, leaving out the other half. Remember Europe's dynamic? It had this constant push and pull, the aristocratic ideal versus the democratic one, and the centralized state versus the revolutionary impulse. These opposing forces acted like a tension wire, keeping things balanced, offering checks and balances. America, however, lost both crucial counterweights. No strong aristocratic tradition to push back against pure democracy, and no deep revolutionary history to challenge unchecked state power. The danger, then, becomes terrifyingly clear. What happens when the desire for equality meets a powerful centralized government? Tocqueville saw the terrifying possibility of a tyranny of the majority, where the will of the many crushes individual rights and freedoms. It's like having a rocket engine democracy bolted onto a tank full of volatile fuel, centralized state, with no safety valves. So, while looking at Europe, Tocqueville basically warned his contemporaries, look, equality is coming, you can't stop it. But how it turns out, whether it brings us freedom or slavery, wisdom or barbarism, wealth or misery, depends entirely on you guys. Now let's talk about how Tocqueville actually wrote about America. Was he glowing with admiration? Not really. There's very little unqualified praise. His attitude was, shall we say, profoundly ironic. He wasn't exactly sitting in the stands cheering. He was more like a detached observer, maybe even a bit smug, looking down on the American experiment. He saw it as a fascinating case study, sure, but one that didn't exactly inspire confidence in producing anything truly great for humanity. He didn't see it as some grand uplifting journey, or even a tragic arc where suffering leads to wisdom. For Tocqueville, the American version of democracy, stripped of its European restraints, was doomed to end in something rather sad and unimpressive. He did emphasize that humans aren't just puppets controlled by their race or geography. He hated deterministic thinking, calling it false and cowardly because it breeds weaklings. He believed there's always a space for freedom within constraints. But despite this, his overall assessment of America's future, and by extension, the future of democracy itself, was pretty bleak. This lack of optimism probably explains why his work wasn't exactly embraced with open arms in America during the second half of the 19th century. Even John Stuart Mill, who praised Tocqueville's insights, felt this underlying hostility towards democracy's unchecked path. Okay, so if America is this cautionary tale, what about Europe? Tocqueville saw himself living through the final act of the old aristocratic play, and having witnessed America, he wanted to show how Europe's own democratic act could unfold. His goal wasn't just to describe America, it was to help Europe avoid repeating its mistakes, specifically, to dodge a future where democracy became monolithic and potentially stifling. He saw Western civilization as fractured, split in two, America, this new powerful entity across the water, and Europe, struggling internally, unable to decide its direction, unsure of its own strengths. His book, The Old Regime and the Revolution, was designed with a similar strategy to democracy in America, but with a twist. Both aimed to temper extremes. For America, it was about calming fears of democracy and highlighting its flaws. For Europe, it was about doing the opposite for Democrats, showing that their beloved revolution actually sprang from the very aristocratic system it claimed to overthrow. Talk about irony. At the same time, he pointed out the uncomfortable continuity between the old regime and the new, especially the scary growth of the centralist state, which threatened the very liberty the revolutionaries fought for. It was a double-edged sword, reminding Democrats of the revolution's complex roots and warning everyone about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of progress. Let's zoom in on the old regime book itself. Tocqueville stated up front what he wanted to do: figure out how much the new France was like the old one, and crucially, what was gained and what was lost in that massive upheaval. His method was interesting. When he found virtues in the past like independence, ambition, faith, things he felt were fading, he highlighted them. But when he found vices that still plagued the present, he emphasized those too, arguing that understanding past problems helps us understand current ones. The point wasn't just dusty history. It was to help his contemporaries move past pointless anger about the past and equally pointless, uncritical celebration of the present. So the viewpoint was clearly liberal, valuing liberty, progress, etc., but the tone? It was distinctly conservative. He tried to sound objective, even ironic, but there was an undertone of caution, almost a warning to the old regime supporters. Hey, maybe look out for yourselves? He refused to see the revolution as some inevitable, unstoppable force or a simple monolithic destiny. No, for Tocqueville it was a specific event, born from human choices facing real options. Like the old regime, it had its own history, its own personality, its own good and bad points. It wasn't just a black box, it was a complex process he wanted to dissect. Think of the old regime as an attempt at conservation, not in the sense of stopping time, but of preserving something valuable in the future. Tocqueville wasn't trying to rewind the clock or freeze Europe in amber. His goal was to shape the coming democratic era into something freer, more human. But here's the kicker. His idea of being more human was heavily influenced by aristocratic values, independence, a certain spirit, things he felt were being lost. When he commented on Burke wanting to return to tradition, Tocqueville basically said, "Burke, you don't get it." The revolution wasn't just about fixing a few things. It was about tearing down the entire ancient common law of Europe. We can't just put the clock back. The revolution aimed to break completely with the past, create a clean break. But Tocqueville argued this didn't actually happen. The attempt failed, and surprisingly, he suggested, the revolution didn't change as much as people thought. Even if it hadn't happened, he claimed, the old system would have eventually collapsed, just maybe more slowly, piece by piece. The revolution, in his view, was actually the natural, albeit abrupt, outcome of trends already brewing. It was an imminent reality, something already there, waiting to happen. So, far from being a radical break, it was deeply rooted in the past it supposedly rejected. This made him respect both the revolution and the masses involved, not because they were perfect, but because they existed and revealed fundamental truths about human nature and society. So, who's the tragic figure in this old regime story? It's the old regime itself. Tocqueville portrays it as caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, the logic of building a stronger, more centralized state. On the other, the undeniable pull of human aspirations for change and betterment. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The monarchy tried reforms, yes, trying to improve life for everyone. But these efforts constantly bumped up against the regime's own contradictions and commitments, and paradoxically, often just made people demand even more reform. It was a lose-lose situation. By the time the revolution loomed, France was a tangled mess of contradictions. Everyone seemed to hate the system, and nothing short of a complete overhaul could possibly satisfy them. Tocqueville nails it with a classic example: a nation obsessed with getting richer and living better, while the government, on one hand, encouraged this but on the other, actively blocked it. It's like a parent constantly telling their kid to eat vegetables, but then giving them candy instead. This fatal inconsistency, this inability to reconcile the desire for prosperity with the means to achieve it, was, in Tocqueville's view, the very thing that sealed the old regime's doom. What lit the fuse for the revolution? Tocqueville identifies two deep-seated passions in the French psyche. First, an ancient, almost uncontrollable urge to smash the old medieval structures and build a society where people were as equal as possible, acknowledging differences but aiming for parity. Second, a more recent, though equally strong, passion for freedom, not just equality but freedom. By the late 1780s, both these desires were burning brightly. When the revolution began, they collided, merged, and fueled each other, creating a wildfire of revolutionary fervor. Why did this happen now? Because people suddenly realized their dreams of equality and freedom clashed violently with the reality of the social system that had, paradoxically, served them reasonably well for centuries. Tocqueville blames intellectuals, in part, their constant criticism and utopian blueprints for a perfect society alienated ordinary people from the flawed but functional world around them. They created this dazzling, imaginary ideal land, simple, fair, rational, and it hypnotized the masses, making them long for a world that didn't exist, pulling them away from the real, albeit imperfect, present. The problem, Tocqueville argues, wasn't that the old regime was bad, it was chaotic. But that objective conditions for most people had actually improved before the revolution compared to what followed for decades. This brings us to a fascinating paradox Tocqueville highlights. Look at the numbers, he says, comparing decades before and after the revolution. The truth is, national prosperity was growing faster in the 2 decades leading up to 1789 than in any single decade after it. The very success of the old regime, its increasing wealth, worked against it. He contrasts this with England, arguing that national strength isn't just about fancy laws or complex systems. It's about the spirit, the vitality. England's wealth comes from a vibrant, functioning whole, not just clever mechanics. France, this rising tide of prosperity bred discontent. People became restless, increasingly hostile to old institutions, feeling that things could be and should be better. Interestingly, Tocqueville notes that dissatisfaction was highest precisely where improvements had been most noticeable. It's like complaining loudest when things are getting slightly better, but not as good as you hoped. He points out a historical pattern. Revolutions often erupt when a long-suffering population suddenly sees the boot lifted, not necessarily when conditions are worst. The order overthrown is often better than the one that came before. Why? Because grievances simmer unnoticed until the possibility of fixing them appears. Once you fix one thing, you notice all the other things wrong, and they seem even worse. Think about feudalism. It inspired less hatred at its peak than right before it fell. Or Louis XVI's minor slaps felt worse than Louis XIV's total control. People were dazzled by the promise of unprecedented happiness, blind to the real progress already made. Tocqueville uses another powerful metaphor here: the organic body. Just like a living organism has a vital spark, an energy source independent of its organs, so too do societies. When that vital flame dims, the whole thing starts to decay, even if the parts still seem to function. The old regime, in his view, lost this spark. Its efforts to modernize, to improve, actually contributed to its downfall. By creating a society where everyone was isolated, the bourgeoisie cut off from nobles, peasants from both, and even within classes, people divided into tiny disconnected groups, it fostered rebellion. The nation looked unified on the surface, but internally it was falling apart. Nothing could stop the central government, but nothing could support it either. The magnificent castles built by kings were doomed to crumble when the social foundation shook. And here comes the ironic twist. Tocqueville observes that France, seemingly learning from its rulers' mistakes, managed to shake off their domination effectively. But, he adds with a wry smile, it couldn't quite ditch the bad habits, the false ideas, the harmful tendencies that the old regime either gave it or let it develop. Sometimes, he says, France even showed a slave mentality when exercising its newfound freedom, proving just as incapable of governing itself as it was under masters. It's like breaking free from a cage but still walking like a prisoner. So, how does Tocqueville tie the past to the present? Like many historians of his time, he saw threads connecting his own age to the old regime. But what he found was a dubious legacy. What linked them? Two big things: the relentless push towards state centralization and the enduring love of equality. The problem? These two weren't necessarily opposites. In fact, Tocqueville argued that the French people were prone to accepting despotic practices, as long as the government promised to favor their desire for equality. It's like trading your freedom for a guarantee of equal treatment, even if that treatment is poor. There was another thread, weaker and more flickering, the desire for freedom. This impulse came and went, sometimes reviving, sometimes dying down. And it wasn't reliably tied to the other trends. Those obsessed with equality could be incredibly stubborn, even blind, willing to give up anything for the sake of it. So where was the hope for genuine freedom? Tocqueville looked not to abstract principles, but to the peculiar character of the French people themselves, the very people who had birthed and nurtured the revolutionary tradition. They held the key. What makes the French people so special, or so problematic in Tocqueville's eyes? He describes them as a whirlwind of contrasts, always extreme, driven by emotion rather than fixed ideas. You never quite know what to expect. Sometimes they're brilliant, sometimes disastrous. They can be led easily if nobody resists, but once a revolution starts, nothing can stop them from jumping in. They are, he says, the most brilliant and dangerous of European nations, always capable of inspiring admiration, hatred, pity, or alarm, but never indifference. They are the antithesis of the Americans, predictable in their focus on equality. Tocqueville clearly admires this unpredictability, this energy. But unlike Michelet, who saw it as almost mystical, Tocqueville believed it had historical roots, explained in his book. He saw the French people as the guardians of the revolutionary flame, the potential saviors of Europe. This revolutionary tradition, for all its chaos, was seen as the solvent for the worst aspects of pure egalitarianism, the counterweight to unchecked state power, the antidote to nostalgia or complacency, and ultimately, the best hope for continued human progress and freedom. It was the unpredictable, messy, vital force he hoped could guide Europe away from the pitfalls of both anarchy and tyranny. Now Tocqueville himself valued order, perhaps more than freedom. But he drew a line. Unlike Burke, who used love of order to argue against change, or the Hegelian right, who twisted Hegel's ideas to justify the status quo simply because it existed, Tocqueville resisted this. During a visit to Prussia, he saw Hegelianism being used to worship the present as a divine right, and that deeply offended him. He believed history was always open to human judgment and revision based on current needs. Similarly, he was repulsed by Gobineau's racist theories, not just for the racism, but because Gobineau was creating a new kind of deity, a mythical past, just as oppressive as the supposedly rational present. This ironic, skeptical, almost nihilistic view of history didn't disappear after the Enlightenment. It just went underground. Thinkers like de Maistre, Chateaubriand, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, they all carry echoes of this ironic skepticism. After the revolutions of 1848 and 51, This ironic perspective really took over as the dominant way of thinking about history, replacing the earlier romantic optimism and the comic view of progress. It paved the way for nationalist histories, positivist science of history, and aesthetic approaches. Tocqueville saw this wave coming, especially in Gobineau's work. He tried to offer an alternative, a tragic conception of history that acknowledged the harsh realities, but still offered a sliver of hope, a way to understand the present struggle without giving in to despair. Let's look closer at Tocqueville's critique of Gobineau. Gobineau completely rejected the idea of progress, seeing history as a long, sad decline from racial purity to universal decay. He spoke with a chilling, detached realism, claiming he was just stating facts, not passing moral judgments. "I'm not telling you you're guilty or you're innocent," he'd say. "I'm telling you you're dying. Your autumn is here, winter is coming, no children." He positioned himself as a doctor diagnosing an inevitable illness, not a prophet trying to change the outcome. Tocqueville's objections were fundamentally ethical. He feared the impact of Gobineau's ideas on morale. He asked, "Don't you see how your doctrine breeds pride, violence, scorn, tyranny?" He saw it as a modern, materialistic version of Calvinist fatalism, giving up on trying to understand human events through the actions of individuals, emotions, beliefs. "It's about facts versus theories," Tocqueville argued. "Facts yield truth. Theories yield opinion, often pessimistic opinion, suited to a post-revolutionary malaise." Gobineau retorted that he dealt only in facts, not morals. But Tocqueville fired back, accusing Gobineau of profoundly distrusting humanity, believing it incapable of improvement, destined for servitude. Tocqueville refused to despair. He believed societies become worthwhile through the use of liberty, and while maintaining it is harder now, it's never impossible. He prayed he wouldn't lose hope, refusing to accept that humanity was doomed to be a worthless flock needing shepherd masters. So did Tocqueville himself fall into this ironic despair? Looking at his memoirs from 1850, reflecting on the period 1789 to 1830, the mood shifts. He sees history as a brutal 41-year battle between the old ways and the new middle-class order, with the latter's victory being definitive. The old regime, both good and bad, is gone. Here, the ironic, almost cynical tone replaces the tragic acceptance of democracy in America. He lets out some of the despair he held back earlier. By 1856, with the old regime, the tone is even more subdued. He aims to objectively assess gains and losses, but the social climate has soured, leaving him with only cautious pessimism. Yet the core of the tragic writer remains. He believes the revolution, despite its flaw, reflects deeper social processes that, if understood, can moderate passions. Hope gives way to resignation. Even in his notes, he calls the revolution a new and terrible thing, something potentially monstrous, unleashed by intellectuals. The aim of his historical work, though, stayed the same: to understand this new beast. The tone leaned towards irony and pessimism, but the underlying viewpoint was still tragic, seeking to bring these harsh realities to consciousness for the sake of social improvement. He resisted easy answers, trying to remain open to all classes, though he admitted no faith in the lower orders despite a flicker of hope. This ambiguity, this refusal to pick a side in the post-1848 world demanding clear stances, likely contributed to why his nuanced, flexible vision wasn't fully appreciated in his time. So wrapping up, Tocqueville stands as a master of tragic realism. Like Hegel, he focused on the social world, where human consciousness bumps up against reality, struggles, and often fails to find a neat progressive solution. He kicked out supernatural explanations but also rejected simplistic biological determinism. Nature was a stage, a constraint, but not the director. Humans, with their reason and will, were the main actors, constantly battling the society they themselves created. Historical knowledge, for him, wasn't just about the past. It was a tool for the present, helping us understand our struggles and maybe even gain some control over history's demon. Yet, in the end, even he had to admit the drama wasn't truly tragic or comic in the classical sense, but more like a slow decay, a theme he ironically criticized Gobineau for emphasizing. Whether you label him historian or sociologist misses the point. He was doing both, analyzing structures and processes. Crucially, he forced us to question if the revolution actually happened, forcing us to look beyond easy labels. His work is liberating because it strips away comforting illusions, placing the meaning of history not in the past, but in the future choices we make, informed by a painful awareness of the past's ambiguity. Ultimately, his vision aligns closely with thinkers like Mill, emphasizing a continuous struggle between good and evil forces, where the virtue lies not in easy victory, but in the persistent effort to serve the greater good, acknowledging the legitimacy of opposing forces. That's Tocqueville's enduring legacy.